In 1916, two women meet on a train going north during the Great Migration. Over the next 80 years and 3 generations, their lives will become intertwined. So begins the story that is Coleman Hill, told through the eyes of 9 family members. I'm very excited to be here today with Kim Coleman Foote, the author of Coleman Hill, and with Sarah Jessica Parker, its editor. I'm Erin Wicks, and I'm Kim's editor. Kim, can you tell us a little bit about the book in your own words, please?
Yes, so Coleman Hill basically is inspired by my family and their Great Migration journey. It started out with my 2 great-grandmothers. Coming up from the South as young women, young mothers, and they both lost their husbands soon after arriving to New Jersey. And I always wondered what that experience was like for them to be raising children on their own. Also, they ended up owning their own homes on a domestic salary. They never remarried. How did they do that? And also, there are some traumas that happened in my family that reverberated throughout the generations. And I was fascinated at the same time that there were these really bold women in my family, because I was that bold little girl growing up, that little sassy girl with all the confidence. So I was inspired hearing these stories about how, just confident and strong they were, but then they turned that on their children and their grandchildren. So I was just fascinated by that duality and wanted to know what were the roots of that.
So what kind of research did you do to get at that story?
Lots of research, but it was inadvertent because I was always interested in history. I heard these stories about my family growing up as a little girl in Jersey. And so I was just always immersed in history and thinking about, times years before my birth, in the 40s, for example. And so I became interested in genealogy when I was in college. And so I started doing research. I would go to the National Archives, the Library of Congress when I lived in DC. And I'd look at census records, which are the government records of, the population census that was taken every 10 years in this country. And I basically found those 2 great-grandmothers. Those were some of the earliest census records that I found. And I literally screamed when I found them because I didn't think my family would be on the records because, they were poor, they were sharecroppers, farmers, they weren't, quote, educated, so I didn't think that history really cared about them. And to see their names actually on written records in, this magnificent government building, it basically set off this hunger to know more about my family. And so I really found I amassed so many documents very, very quickly, actually, with my family. And again, just to be able to see, I was in my early 20s at that point, and to be able to see, oh my God, my grandmother is a 10-year-old, right? Intellectually you could think oh yeah, I know, of course, that my ancestors were children, but to see it there on paper, and the fact that they're 10 or they're 14, and oh look, they're already a farmer on the field working, and it shows how much education they had, right? How much money sometimes they made, how much their rent was, or how much their homes cost. Just to see those tangible details made me want to know more. So lots and lots of research. And I also interviewed family members to get more information from that.
What were some of the most surprising things that all of this research yielded?
One of the most surprising was actually when I went down south for the first time, or second time. I went down to Alabama to meet family members who had actually never really left the South. And they told me about my great-great-grandmother. And she was on this is on my mother's side.
Okay.
Mother's father's side, specifically. And she was on that first census that I actually found, which was in 1900 in Alabama. And they told me this really fascinating story about her, the fact that there were pigs rooting under her house from the neighbor's farm. And if you look at that census, they're the only black family for miles. On either side of them, there's white farmers, and they're the only black family. And this, mind you, is Jim Crow South, right, where people are getting lynched, and discrimination is in full force, right? So legalized segregation is in full force. And the pigs came under her house, and she got so angry that she took boiling water and she threw it on the white man's pigs. And then he comes to her with a shotgun, which he puts in her face, and she stares down the barrel of the shotgun and says, "Go ahead and pull it."
Whoa.
And I'm just like, what? And this woman, she was probably very short also. So again, to hear this story, I was just like, that was badass. Either
Yes.
badass, crazy, or both, right? But I was just, again, that was one of the most fascinating stories. And, you know, that's what you get when you actually talk to people, because the record doesn't say any of that. The record just has a name and a date. And like I said, it has interesting facts. But to really be able to talk to the family, and I'm glad that stories like that got passed down, because that's what makes people come alive and history come alive.
Oh, what an incredible story.
Yes.
I'm not surprised you're descended from that fierce woman.
Yes. I have her genes.
You can tell.
Yes, but not everybody has the genes, which is interesting, you know. And again, it's especially thinking about the novel and how, you know, I show all these different family members and different perspectives, because not everyone was the same, right? You had people, obviously, who I can see in my family, the women who kind of inherited that gumption and fierceness, right? But then there were others who were considered weak, right? Who couldn't stand up for themselves, right? So there's all these different personalities in my family.
Yeah.
Sarah Jessica, I'm curious, what drew you to Kim's book? Why did you want to publish it on your imprint?
Well, I wasn't alone. I think when all of us who had the privilege of reading that early manuscript, were all stunned by the skill and the kind of deep understanding, like an emotional understanding and a curiosity that was so recognizable immediately in the manuscript. But I think also just purely as a story, like when you respond to story as a reader, and we all have different things that we love about books, and we have genres that we love, but I think the story of this family was so exciting. It was unknown to me in many ways. It was known in some small ways. It's a very American story, that migration north, but it remains singular because of this family's unique relationships with one another, the role the women played, the strength of the women, the courage, the huge disappointments, the obstacles. And I had just not seen it put together and woven together, like I said, with such skill and heart and humor in the most surprising times, but also that it was so specific to this town in New Jersey, right across the bridge, or a tunnel that I knew nothing about, which just made me more curious and greedy to go as far as Kim allowed in this book. Like, there is not a moment that you don't want to be there, you know. And in fact, it's one of those books that's very hard to put down. You're very invested in these people. It's heartrending. Like I said, it can be amusing. The humor that they find is shocking. It's inspiring. But I think in its complete wholeness, it is a hugely satisfying read. And it's fresh. Nobody else has done this. Nobody else could do this. And what's been thrilling is to, now that it's available, to witness other people experiencing what we've known now for the last 12 months, 10 months, I can't even remember now. But we're not alone, and we were right.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very true. So beautifully put, and there's so many questions I have kind of spinning off of that. I think, you know, one of them is, you know, something that you mentioned is that there is so much hardship in this book. There are so many challenges, but there's also so much heart and humor and love. And I'd really love to hear you, Kim, talk about how that emerged, and something we've talked about is like the different kinds of love, and how important it was for you to show how love works. And I just would love to hear you speak more about that, because it's such an important theme of the book.
Yes. I love humor. You know, there is an aunt who inspired one of the characters who actually wanted to be a stand-up comedian. I wanted to be a stand-up comedian. I still flirt with the idea, maybe one day, but and so I love making people laugh, you know, and so the humor it was just natural for me to bring it in. And I felt like also I needed something to balance the heaviness, you know, but again, it was kind of a natural integration that came in because I feel like I can't just write negative, 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 you know, and even when I see like other movies or books, you know, I call it trauma porn, which, you know, I get so angry and riled up seeing something like that because, you know, as human beings, we aren't just all one expression, right? We aren't all victims. We aren't all hate. We aren't all love, you know, so we have the range of emotions. And so I wanted to put that in there for the characters. And then in terms of love, like, yeah, I mean, it was so essential for me to show the different ways that my family, you know, felt about love because even obviously in our popular media, in our songs, our movies, I think the majority depict love in a very toxic way, you know, that I don't even think is love. You know, it is just abuse, right? Yeah, and or obsession even. And so for me, it was important, especially because in my family, the way that it played out, you know, like someone literally thought that pain was love, you know, to get physically abused, to get emotionally abused, to get yelled at, you know, disrespected. They thought that that was love. And I know there's a lot of people out there even today who still think that that's love. And what is love, right? They think that that's something that they should want and accept, basically. And I just disagree with that, you know, but I wanted to represent that perspective because again, there are many people who believe in that. And so I felt it was also important to show the opposite, you know, for people who don't agree, who agree that love should not be pain. And so you basically see that play out in particular between characters inspired by my grandmother and her sister, where my grandmother thought that, again, to be treated horribly was a good thing for her, where her sister said, oh, hell no. No way will a man beat me. No way will a man yell at me, so much that she refused to even marry, right? So, yeah.
And you know, something you said earlier about the strength and the fierceness of a lot of the women traits that you have inherited, and that there are women that, you know, characters in the book that aren't able to exhibit those. And you let us know why you're not making excuses for any of the behaviors that create our persons, you know, and inform how we respond to men or women or family. But there's also, in somebody conveying weakness or timidity, there is also, it's accompanied by strength. You know, if you think about Bertha, and I won't try to describe that character because she is so much, in many ways, the heartbeat of this book, or Jebby, like two people who are on the receiving end of behavior, and then they react, and they're, you know, one might be called weak or dependent upon or lacking independence, Bertha, you know. But there's so much about her that is so strong,
Yeah.
and so noble,
Yeah.
and so dignified and so elegant, that it is those qualities which are actually, in my estimation, a form of courage. And Jebby, who makes choices, who a lot of us we love so much, you know, especially because of the last part of the book, that trip that is so touching and cinematic, and, you know, and you allow us to understand people. And I guess that was part of your mission,
Yes.
your search, was, why do people laugh when that person does something to that person, and they find it amusing or funny, and you are struck by your own very different reaction to it. But I think you really allow the reader to really have an intimate experience with these characters. You don't flatten them, you don't make them less dimensional so we can understand them. You give them all their complexity, and let us find our way. You know, let us love them without shame or disclaimers. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yes.
It's magnificent.
It was intentional because, again, I felt like I had to represent them as full human beings, and to do that, I had to go to places that I didn't even want to go myself.
Yeah.
You know, like Jebby was not supposed to be part of the original book. It was supposed to be about the women in my family, honoring women's voices. And then he barged in at a certain point, and I was like, okay, fine, Grandpa, fine, in his truck, you know. And then I got to early on in the story, I was like, oh, he's like beating my grandmother, like, oh, yeah, you know. And I'm not a man, also. I had to get into this male body and like recreate. And so I was like, well, how would he represent that? How he, you know, so it became like an act of thinking about how all these characters would justify their behavior from their own, you know, sometimes twisted perspective, but that's them. That's what makes them human, right? And so it started to come out in this very matter-of-fact way. It was just like, oh yeah, I hit her. Yeah, you know, just like you open and close the door, I hit her.
Right.
You know, and then you just move on from that. But at the same time, you know, I didn't let him get away with that.
No.
You know, I didn't let Coleman, my great-grandmother, the character inspired by her, get away with what she did. And so you see the responses, and, you know, you see some of the same incidents happen through the eyes of other characters, and see how they interpret that, right? And so even with Bertha, the first line of that section is she was a weak woman, you know, because that's what I always heard about my grandmother growing up. She was a weak woman. And then as an adult, when I think about, okay, yes, she was so afraid she was kicked out of the house by her mother-in-law, literally. You know, she might have lost a baby, I'm not sure, but that's the fiction version of her.
Yeah.
You know, there is a gap in the kid's birth, you know, so that could have very well happened. But she was so afraid of her mother-in-law that she would not go back to that house. You know, she saw her children, but she would not go back to that town, not go back to that house, right? But at the same time, I started thinking, like, so no one in the family actually knows where she went right afterwards, right? So I had to figure out, and in that figuring out, I was like, okay, here's someone who has, how many, like 5 children? She's kicked out of the house, right? Her mother's not letting her back in her house, right? Like her own mother, who lives like 2-3 blocks away, won't let her live with her. Where is she going to go? She doesn't work, you know, because once she married her husband, my grandfather, you know, wouldn't let her, or she just didn't work, right? But she had worked before, so she has no money, she has no job, she has no references if she wants to get a job. And somehow she survives those couple of years, and she makes her way over to Brooklyn somehow. She ends up with a new man, you know, who treated her a lot better than my grandfather did. She has a new family, and she survives, and she keeps on going. So to me, that means that she had incredible strength. Yeah. You know, and she also kept in touch with her family. You know, she sent them toys and things like that. And I know, like, at some point I was talking, I don't remember if it was you or another editor when I was working on that section, who was saying, like, yeah, but I still feel like Bertha, like, you know, we need to say something more about her because it's still pretty, like, you know, messed up that she left her kids like that. And I was just like,
say that too.
or that she never like went back, or she never tried. And I was like, yeah, but you just don't understand, right? So I had a lot of sympathy for her, you know, even though, again, like, there were the ripple effects, you know, there were the kids who were too young to understand what happened, and, like, you know, almost to their dying day, just believe that their mother was an evil person because she left us. Yeah. She left us. Yeah. You know, and then they looked at Coleman, their grandmother, saying that, oh, she took care of us. She didn't have to do that. I was like, no, she chose to do that as well, right? So I wanted to look at all that complexity, because especially with fiction and any good story, the complexity is what makes it interesting, right? You don't want to read a novel necessarily where everyone's happy and nothing bad happens and everyone's, you know, it's just like you need some type of ups and downs, you need some type of conflict, and this was just, it was naturally already there, you know, and so I wanted to, again, really, really emphasize those connections. Yeah.
It's funny that anybody, and I know it wasn't you, would question or worry about, we have to make sure the reader knows that Bertha has made attempts And that's something that often happens with women in screenplays, in television shows. I've worked on things like, she's not likable enough. I'm like, no one ever says that about a man. He's not like, men can be a gangster and he's, you know, a million qualities and, you know, has a hit list a mile long, and they're like, oh my God,
And
he's
of course
so
he
cool.
never sees his kids.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
What kids?
But it's so clear how it pains Bertha, the choices that she's been left with, which are tiny. It's incredibly painful. And the connection with the sister, Alma, Nell, who comes to her and makes makes these wonderful attempts to bridge the relationship, to be a feeder, you know. But I would not. I so appreciated the limitations on Bertha, because I didn't feel that was a place she could ever go back to. I mean, it was made clear by everybody that there was not shelter for her there.
Yeah, I think that's what you do so well, is that a lot of people put in impossible situations and also, you know, layers of intergenerational family trauma, you know, and the patterns that are learned, and how can you operate out of that. But also, you know, I think even the characters like Jebby and other characters who are abusive, yes, they don't get away with it externally, but internally either. Like, you feel their shame.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You really go that you understand that they're not actually feeling good about themselves. They're not actually sleeping well at night, you know? Nor is Bertha. You know, it's so immensely complex in each individual perspective. And then there's this layering of perspectives where you're seeing the same characters through different eyes and then returning to some eyes, but throughout the course of, again, 80 years. It's incredible.
That's amazing.
It's kaleidoscopic, it's polyphonic, it's gorgeous.
Thank you.
How did it, you know, and I know a little bit about this already, but and I know Sarah Jessica does too, but I want everyone else to know how the book kind of came to you. I know you did all of this research and you were immersed in these family stories from a very young age, but how did this, you know, very creative and sophisticated structure kind of emerge?
Well, first of all, a lot was accidental. I would say probably all of it was accidental. I wasn't really thinking about it. I mean, like, when you say 80 years, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a long time. And I think someone recently, I saw somewhere mention like 30 characters. I was like, oh, there's 30 characters? Oh, that's a lot. But yeah, I wasn't thinking about, you know, I love having lots of characters, you know, and so like, when I read reviews of some of my favorite books, which are multi-voiced, you know, multiple perspectives, and they're like, there's too many characters, I got confused, I'm like, I love that, I love the more the merrier. But it came to me, I would say, like, there was a section in particular called The Pose, which you have the book here, and there's a photograph. I had
Can
an
we find it
assignment.
while you're talking?
Yes, I think it's 27, they said at the event.
I think we figured that out.
And it wasn't numbered. But I had an assignment for my class to.
Don't look at what I've written over there in the past. I was trying to guess who people were. All my notes.
But you know, I had this photograph, and it was assignment to write a story based on a photograph, and so. This aunt here in the middle, her gaze just really struck me. And then she's squeezing this poor little dog. And her sisters looked terrified. And I was like, what is behind this photograph? And then all of a sudden her voice just popped into my head. I ain't afraid of that man or his camera. And the words just kept coming and coming and coming. And for me, that was just like a different experience, because when I write fiction, I see movies in my head. It's just like playing out, you know, and you have the cut reels.
Yeah.
It's like, no, this scene is not going cut. Let's back up. And, you know, and so I never really hear voices. And so I rushed to write them down, and this came out. And basically, this particular aunt, you know, was someone who was vilified in the family. All of the stories, you know, anyone who mentioned her, she was always just this evil, nasty, you know, person. She didn't do her kids right, et cetera, et cetera. She drank, et cetera. And to write this, especially about her as a little girl, all of a sudden it was like, oh, here's where that anger might have come from. Here's where that evil personality might have come from. Her daddy has just died, right? Her mother is mean to her. She has no one to protect her there. You know, there's gender stuff going on with her brother Jebby, you know, where he's the favorite child and the girls are not, right? So there's so much happening in her past that, oh, this could have been where some of that originated. And then, you know, there's no therapy back then. There's no idea of mental health, you know, back then. And so, and there's alcohol. You know, alcohol is a self-medication, right? And so still, even today, right? We don't talk about mental health and family dynamics and all this enough. And so, you know, that could have become her method of self-soothing, right? And, you know, maybe something undiagnosed going on top of that. But, you know, if they had the resources back then, you know, even still today, if people have the resources, we know right here in New York City, like, you know, so many things happen today, especially involving mental health. But so that's how it started, and I was thinking that I could try that experiment with, I had so many photographs from my family that I collected over the years, and some photographs would have been completely trashed, including this one, would have been completely thrown away because, you know, people got older, their friends and family were gone. They're like, I don't want these anymore. You know, like, I don't care. I'm just going to throw them away. Do you want them? Yes, I'll take them. Oh my God, this is like gold, you know, or even more than gold. And so I tried to do that with 3 other photographs, and I started writing, but one I thought would be the easiest to finish because it had a natural format. It was based on the story that my mother told me about how she and her siblings and cousins sat around one day as little kids and they talked about trying to kill their grandmother, who's on the spine, by the way. And I was just like, oh my God. And so, again, it's twisted, but it's easy to write because, okay, here's one method, here's a second method, here's a third method, and I can just write and imagine. So in reality, they didn't try, but I wanted to make them try as fictional characters because I had always wanted to go back in time and beat Greg Coleman myself for how she treated her grandchildren and my grandmother. And so, but I started writing a little bit for each section, and then I started writing the first section. They're braiding her hair, and then all of a sudden they remember how Greg Coleman beat their oldest sister senselessly, you know, and I just burst into tears. And could not finish the story. And for 4 years, I kept trying, get to that line, cry, couldn't go on. So that actually probably was one of the hardest to actually finish, right? But I did, and I never heard the voices in the same way, you know, from using the pictures, but I did, you know, kind of remember the anecdotes that I heard as a little girl, and I wanted to really focus on those key anecdotes and build narratives around them. So like one of my great-grandfathers, I really only knew about him that he died of lockjaw. And he, like, whether it was a rusty nail or a rusty pipe, the story went back and forth, whether he was on a movie house helping build a movie house or some building. But it happened at work, and the fact that he died of this very, like, in this very horrendous, debilitating way, right? That always just like struck me. And so like I built basically a whole narrative around that little snippet of story. Because again, he was one of my great-grandfathers who died young coming up to Jersey. And so also he, you know, there are all his hopes and dreams that died with him because he was only probably about 40 when he passed away.
Yeah, that section, when we get to that in the book, and we're not terribly far in, actually, if you think about, well, those of you who read it. But the minute, without giving anything away, the minute he comes home not feeling well, you're just like, crap. Really, you're like, please don't let this be true. Please don't let this be true. Please let him get the help he needs. Please let him allow some kind of medical intervention. Please. It's just devastating. It's devastating. And then once again, the response, the reaction, what happens because of that? It's like the plates of the earth shift in that house. It's incredible, you know? Yeah. But that's a devastating part of the story, and you start to really understand more so, I guess even more so, you know, you touch on it when the women arrive and Celia arrives and she sees, you know, her husband, right? And you describe it, you read it the other day, and you touch on the disappointment of the North, that it wasn't yes, more money is to be had, especially for African Americans, but not really. It really overpromises and underdelivers. We do. And when he comes home sick, and you understand why, it's just, it's much more, there's such clarity about the massive gulf that exists in work and health and safety and education and opportunity and money. And it's devastating because it's, you know, he's not alone. You know, it's one story. But it's like, oh, it's so upsetting.
Yeah. And especially, it was even more upsetting for me to go to the South and meet those cousins who never left.
Yeah.
And realize that they had advanced much further than my family did. And I was like, how is this possible? Because, again, this is where things weren't so great, right?
Right.
But they had a quick response from me, and they said, oh, because everyone left. You know, everyone left, and so, yes, you know, we had legalized segregation down here, and it was separate but not equal. Right? But at the same time, when so many people left, you know, our schoolhouses became emptier. You know, our teachers might have been very well educated because they could not teach at, you know, majority of colleges.
Yes.
So you had sometimes PhDs who were teaching in, you know, elementary, high schools for Black students, right? And so, and they're like, and our teachers cared about us. You know, there were so few. The teacher-student ratio went down. You know, so people like really, really encouraged us. Oh, you need to, you know, focus on your education and so forth and so on. But then at the same time, I also realized that it was mostly the women who gotten higher degrees, right? And the men, you know, I talked to one male cousin in particular, and I think he was also a Vietnam vet on top of that, you know, and he was very disgruntled, you know, about living in the South because, you know, in the town that family lived, there's a tree, this really creepy, scraggly old tree, and it was nicknamed the lynching tree, right? And in this town, like, you know, there's still the railroad tracks, like even today, obviously, but it's in the South, you know, there's the railroad tracks, you cross the other side where the white people lived, and like George Wallace, the infamous George Wallace, they're like, this is where I'm like, George Wallace grew up here? Like, oh my God, right? You know, so the history is just like right there in your face. Right. So that just really got me angry, and it got me thinking that, you know, okay, yes, the North was better. Like, obviously, some people wouldn't have even lived that long, you know, had they stayed in the South.
Right.
But at the same time, and obviously we have like the exceptional cases, right? Like, so many examples that you can point to of, you know, from entertainers, musicians, newspaper people, medical people. So many people thrived in the North and became big, you know, personalities, etc. But those are kind of the exceptions, right? What about the majority? What about the numbers of people when you look across the board in percentages? So yeah, that just, I realized that had to be a story.
Yeah.
That, you know, because not many people were talking about it. We hear now about the Great Migration more, but it's like, oh yeah, this is that moment right then. But what about the aftermath?
Yeah.
Right? And obviously today we're still dealing with some of the same issues that characters, even in the Deep South, were dealing with here in the North.
Yeah.
How much were you thinking about that history when you were writing it, and how much did it kind of just emerge organically? Like, the context that their characters are situated in does define everything, and yet there's so much outside of that too. But what was kind of that relationship consciously?
Well, I mean, again, like I said, I've been interested in history since I was a little girl, so much that I wanted to be a history major in college.
Were you?
No. I only took 2 history courses, and at some point after college, I was like, why don't I take 2? I love history, and I was like, oh yeah, didn't you remember like history, American history, you know, on the college campus was white American history, right? Yeah. And I did take, the only history courses I took in college were African American history, part 2, I wanted to take part one. I don't know why I didn't. My professor was amazing. But after hearing friends taking part one, they were always like talk at the lunch table, like, oh my God, this is what we learned today. I was just like, oh, I need to take part two because everyone's raving about part one. So I took part two, and I learned so many things in that class that, you know, I'd never heard, even growing up in a Black school that was immersed in like Black history, right? So like we learned about the Red Summer of 1919. We learned about the race riots that happened. And this was like 20 plus years ago. You know, now people know about it more with some of the recent TV shows that have been on TV. But back then, no one was talking about 1919. No one was talking about Tulsa and the race riots, right? But I learned about that because of that class. And the only other history course I took was looking at historical representations of Africa, right? But there weren't many courses within a department that I could have taken that would have, you know, been of interest to me. And so, and one thing, the reason I bring that up is because I remember my very first history paper, I was making connections between the historical and present. And my professor, you know, wrote comments on the paper. She's like, we don't do this in the field of history. We focus on the history.
Really?
We don't make the, and I was just like, what's the point? What's the point of studying? Like, is it to inform us about what's happening today? And I was just like, oh, I need to rethink being a professional historian.
So you just study history in a vacuum.
Yes.
You put yourself in time
At least
and place.
I mean, the professional historians might
I'd like to
differ.
think there were different points of view on that, on the study.
And so, but I just remember I was just like, isn't that so this is not to help us for today, it's just to kind of, And so I was like, I need to rethink my, you know, wanting to be a professional historian. And so I was also interested in being a public historian. You know, there was a specific field of public history because the other thing is, like, I was grateful to attend Swarthmore College, which was one of the top colleges, is one of the top colleges in this country, you know, where they really teach you how to investigate and continually ask questions. Don't take, you know, the research or the perspective at face value. Keep asking and interrogating to get to the real meaning of this. And so, yes, even there, you know, realizing, okay, if I'm a historian with a PhD, I might be teaching at a college like this, and I just saw that history and that information, that knowledge being kind of locked in these four walls, right? And so as a public historian, that meant that I could get outside of academia and spread this information to like a majority of people, like the general public who don't necessarily have money, access. Now we don't have affirmative action anymore, you know, but like access to attend these elite colleges, these elite educational institutions. And so, but all to say, like, so that was a big focus of mine, really, I love history again. I love getting history out to people. It gets under my skin when I hear people who say like that they think history is boring. I know. Right? And I'm like, you haven't heard the story of history because if you learn about history as a story, and it's a story about people, and people are complex. Yeah. You know, this is history that you've been taught maybe is a story about gods, right? Right. These gods who are just perfect, and you memorize their name, you memorize their birth date, their death date, and they did some major thing, and that's it. That's not history. Right. Those are facts. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right? But history is the stories, the relationships between people. Yeah. You know, and you do have victors, yes, sometimes. You do have victims sometimes. But even in a victor and a victim, right? What's going on with them, right? Are they always a victim? Are they always the victor? Right. Right? And I think that those stories, as uncomfortable as they can be, as scary as they can be to some people, you know, ultimately that's where like the learning happens. Because even we as ourselves, we are living history, you know, in our own lives. Yeah. So what examples can we get from these stories? What lessons can we learn from stories? And it was important for me also to talk about these people who are poor, you know, who don't speak proper English, right? Because we don't hear their stories so often. And for me, you know, they themselves were people who thought like, oh, why would anyone want to know about me? I didn't do anything special. My aunt literally told me that, right? I didn't do anything special. But to me, there's still something that we can learn from their lives and their experiences, right? And to me, that's what makes them important.
Yeah.
Oh, that is so beautiful.
And you know, you sort of are a public historian.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
This is, yeah.
that's
Yes.
Now.
what
Exactly.
you are. Maybe you're not formally titled as
Yes.
such, but this is certainly the act of a public historian.
Yes.
Quickly, before we move to some audience questions and kind of off of this, I want to know, pulling back, history in the making, what you both feel about the current book bannings that are going on in this country.
I mean, it's so hard to be quick about it.
Rage.
You'll probably be more articulate. You're a very calm person. You're a very measured person. I tend to be hysterical. I'm deeply disturbed, worried. Thinks it speaks to a much larger problem, which seems to have a huge amount of surprising and not surprising momentum. Don't understand it. It contradicts itself. We have public libraries. They are home and shelter, their safety, their access, they're the gateway. They are the nerve central of possibilities and opportunities. Books are there on a shelf. No one's ever forced in a public library to read anything, but the idea that something will not be available to somebody that we don't know at all, what they need, why they're there, what is going on, who exists in their life, what support system exists, what their faith is, what their interest in faith is, what their interest in sexuality is. Never been in a library in my entire life where any librarian dictated anything to me unless I asked for direction. Please shepherd me. I don't know where to find, who to find, how to understand. If we lose that, we lose the fundamental part of our civic life in communities. We lose a home for people. It is, in my opinion, that simple. We are taking a home from people.
I'll just say I'm angry, but it also makes sense when you have people who are afraid of the power of literature. People who are afraid of the power of fiction, right? Because I also meet a lot of people as a fiction writer who are like, oh, I don't read fiction, it's fake. I don't like fake stuff. I just read the facts and news, and I'm just like, ugh. But that shows the power of fiction, right? That's a positive spin. This is powerful stuff. That people can be so afraid that they feel threatened by a fictional character, first of all. Second of all, I would say read Fahrenheit. Is it Fahrenheit 351?
Yeah.
But that's probably banned.
Oh, for years, yes. Early to the party, yes.
But read Fahrenheit 351 because that was sci-fi or speculative, right?
Yeah.
But that talked about burning books, right? And I read that in high school.
Yeah.
So it's not sci-fi.
No, I know.
And I think that was also based on probably what actually happened, like in Europe during the Holocaust and whatnot, where like, you know, because this is not the first time it's happened.
No.
You know, it's happened throughout history. But again, it just shows the power of words and the power of story. And I'll just say that, you know, I mean, I think as human beings, like, we hunger for story. And ultimately, we do hunger for that diversity.
Yes,
you know, even though,
course.
again, there's some people, again, it's fear. But that power of that spirit, it can't be suppressed. It can't be suppressed, and people will find some way to get their hands on story.
I hope so, and I hope we can, you know, be subversive about the ways in which we make sure stories are in people's hands. I think the part that is so mystifying and creates, for me, the rage about this is that I'm afraid of other people's feelings. I'm very afraid of a kind of rhetoric that's become very common to hear. But we live in a country that is a democracy where those people have the right and are protected by law to say the things that make me feel afraid, that I don't agree with, or I object to, strongly object to, that their words can be on a shelf in a library, and I would fight for the right for those books to exist. They just want to be alongside the books that we, a collective of millions and millions and millions of people, also want to be available to readers. It's just fundamental.
Yes.
And I really have such affection and admiration and such for librarians, you know, who are battling in tiny places and large cities where it shouldn't be an issue, we think. And then there's small towns that are supporting their librarians, and you know, and I think a lot of us are reading more and more articles and seeing the kind of activism around just supporting libraries and making sure they have the funding they needed, which is always, you know, like good, you know. But it's librarians that are really on the front line, and it's not just in our public libraries in our communities. It's happening in our schools, as we know, and it's not just in our schools. It's in our community libraries. So it's a very you know, frightening kind of infection.
It's horrifying and very, very well stated, both of you. To pull back a little from our rage.
Yes.
So necessary, so deserved, right? We did have a reader submit a question in advance, and then we have a couple more coming in. This is from James in Seattle, and he says, "What do you think we can learn from the two matriarchs in Coleman Hill, Celia and Lucy?"
So much. I would say, I mean, the most obvious are strength and resilience, right? But then you can learn about a friendship, right? A friendship of people, again, who are very different, who have different, you know, are different from even their physical appearance, right? But how is it that people can forge a friendship when they're so different, right? Obviously, that friendship fizzles out, but again, how do we form friendships with people who are so different from us and have different perspectives and so forth?
So Jessica, what did you learn or take from their friendship?
I think what strikes me so much about that friendship is the kind of loyalty that was unspoken, the communal experience of coming from the South and basically arriving together. And because of that, having this affinity and affection and sorority, sisterhood, in the way it sort of gets in front of being mothers for a minute. You know, if you look at the decisions that Lucy makes in this story, vis-a-vis Bertha, and you know how that all happens, and that a friendship kind of almost was the strength of their womanhood. And I think a lot of the way that we understand women in this book, how necessary it was to have a connection, what it made you feel like to know that somebody else was sharing an experience. And what I learned is that those feelings I understand and need myself, my female friendships, and the strength, but that we are individuals. You said, you know, earlier, we're not all one. African Americans aren't one feeling, you know, and these women weren't, but their friendship sort of dictated in some ways a reliance and almost a loyalty that sometimes took precedence over other choices you thought they would make, you know, and I think because we get to know the characters, we also understand how conflicted they were about that, but about honor, faith, family, women's roles, black women's roles, you know, I guess it's just learning from these two women what that meant for them and how that kind of led their lives in a way, the same and different.
Yeah, beautifully stated, both of you. Another question coming in. Oh, it's a little small to read.
Do you want to read it to us? You can just read it.
You both have a deep love for reading.
True.
Fun question. What is the most unusual place you've read a book?
You've read in a book?
The most unusual place.
Oh, read a book.
Oh, I have a good answer for that.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, in the first Hocus Pocus movie, I've read from hanging from the flies. Yeah, I've read from, I don't know, 40, 50, 60 feet up in between the camera being moved or the lens being changed or lighting being changed, and I would just have a book. I could fold like the New Yorker in 3 or in half and tuck it inside my corset and inside my skirt. So when they called cut, I'd just say, I'll stay up here. And I'd read. And I have books reading. Oh, I have books reading from the second Hocus Pocus movie. Maybe even your manuscript.
Oh, really?
Possible. And I would just say, no, I'll just stay up here. And somebody would be holding the manuscript if I couldn't fit it. And they would reach up or get a thing and hand it to me on a claw.
Were you upside down too?
No, it was upside right.
Okay.
It was upside right. Yeah.
Incredible.
Oh my god. I mean, I haven't really read. I mean, a bathtub when I was a kid, like, cause like I used to take baths on like the weekends, and like that would be like my me time when I was a kid growing
Yeah.
up. And but then I mean, this is not unusual also, like for kids who just love books. So after my parents would go to sleep,
Yeah, lights on.
lights off,
Underneath.
under the covers with a flashlight.
I spent a lot of time like that.
Definitely.
A lot of time like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh.
wow. Okay.
Oh, it's time for
We're
that.
already to this or that. I'm so excited. You ready to play?
No.
Kim is first. So
Uh-oh.
tell me this or that. Bookmark or dog ear?
Neither.
What do you
What? Do you use the flap? You remember what page you're on?
Yeah. But someone,
So intimidating.
I don't know, my brain is special. No,
Wow, your brain is special.
That's true.
Amen.
Somebody
Amen.
pointed it out one day, and then I lost it. I was like, oh, why'd you say it? But I'm like, okay, 165, choo. 5 hours later, I'm just like, and I'm bad with numbers too. I'm like, what? Oh, we have 165. Yeah. So
Oh no, I can't do that.
I only dog ear when I really like something. And so bookmarks.
Look
even
at all
though
the dog
they're-
ears,
They're
Kim.
beautiful. They're beautiful bookmarks for Coleman Hill, and I want one of them.
Oh yes, and
want
I don't even
but
have one in
I don't
here.
really use them.
Got you.
I do both. I do a bookmark that's sentimental, like an airline ticket or something, and it moves from book to book to book to book. I dog ear special passages, things I want to talk about, things I want to remember, things I'm going to actually use in a circumstance that is completely seemingly unrelated. There might be a passage of words that I think are interesting, or so I mark those, I circle them. This is a business card from Carol.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, do you remember? I've got a podcast.
Yeah. I love.
But this is marked up. But I kind of do both. What I also like to do a lot is the flap.
Oh yeah.
But what is really amazing is when the flap no longer can be front to back, and then you got to switch from back to middle or back to, the other way. Yeah, I do it all.
Love it. Love it. Hardcover or paperback?
Depends on how much money I have.
Yeah,
But hardcover. Hardcover.
hardcover. My daughter Loretta is always like, "Can we get the hardcover?"
And I just have to say I'm glad I'm publishing now while there are hardcovers that still exist.
Yes.
Because that was my biggest fear, that everything would be digital by the time I was ready to publish. So yes,
Yeah.
I'm glad to have a hardcover.
I love a hardcover.
And it's beautiful.
Happy to have a paperback if necessary, but
Yes. Coffee or wine?
oh,
Neither.
wine.
Neither.
Neither.
Oh wow,
Then what?
Water.
wow.
Disciplined.
You keep being better than us.
It's weird.
Sarah Jessica?
Wine. I mean, it's not my morning drink. It's not instead of coffee.
Before 11 a.m.
But, I mean, I don't drink that much coffee anyway. I have one in the morning. That's it, but boy, do I count on that.
Yes. Fireside or poolside?
Ooh. Depends on the weather.
Good answer.
Both, I would say. Yeah, depends on the weather.
Poolside.
Color-coded bookshelf or alphabetized?
Oh my
Alphabetized. So I love color coded.
I think color code is beautiful. we have it in one room, but I had some order, you know, like favorite, most important books I won't loan, and over time it just becomes a wonderful repository for everything with absolutely no order. And I also think that that's really beautiful. I've seen order. There's that one publisher that only publishes blue. Who is that publisher? And they win a lot of awards.
Oh.
They're a European or English publisher, but everything's blue. It's kind of amazing. I have admiration for people who can color code or alphabetize. I can't.
I mean, mine aren't
it's-
alphabetized. I'm just saying, just preference, you know, between
yeah.
color.
If you could or
no,
would.
No, I have shells arranged by different themes. And,
Wow.
yeah.
Once
I mean,
again,
that's a whole
better.
procrastination thing. It's like, I might color, I was thinking of color coding one day, but that's procrastination.
yeah. Exactly.
Love it.
Yes.
Plot-driven or character-driven?
Character. Yeah.
Character.
Yeah.
Right answer. I mean, there's no right answer.
Yes.
Reread or something new?
Something new.
Something new. Except for Kim's book, which I've read 4 times.
And I have to say the same because I reread.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
Very few books I would read so many times.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much
Oh,
for joining us
Thank
today.
you. It's so good to see you.
Thank you.
It's always good to see you.
Yes. Same.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes. Thank you.
Happy Sunday.